He was missing an arm, blind in one eye. His skull carried the dent of a blow that should have killed him instantly, and he lived for years afterward, deep in Shanidar Cave, in the mountains of northern Iraq. Archaeologists found this Neanderthal skeleton and immediately hit a wall of impossible questions. 40,000 years ago, in a world with no medicine, no antibiotics, no safety net of any kind, how does a one-armed, half-blind man survive long enough for his bones to heal around the damage? Picture the cave itself, smoke curling toward a low stone ceiling, the smell of scorched fat and wet fur. Somewhere near the fire, a group of people are doing something that shouldn't have been possible in a world this hard. They're keeping a man alive who can no longer hunt, fight, or even see danger coming from his blind side. Someone is cutting his food into smaller pieces. Someone is changing the moss packed against his old wounds. This isn't survival of the fittest. This is something else entirely. The answer to what kept him alive is the answer to a much bigger question. What actually killed ancient humans? And why did they die so young? Because the story you've probably heard is wrong. For over a century, the number repeated in textbooks was 30. That was supposedly the average life expectancy of an ancient human. Short, brutal, over almost before it began. But that number is a magic trick. It comes from averaging in a staggering number of infants and children who never reach their 5th birthday. If an ancient person survived childhood, their odds of reaching 60 were far better than you'd think. The real killer wasn't old age. It was infancy. But that wasn't the strangest discovery. Somewhere in a hut warmed by embers, a mother presses her palm against her son's forehead and feels heat radiating back at her like a small fire under the skin. He's 4 years old. 2 winters ago, a famine tore through the valley, and this same child nearly starved. His body remembers it in a way she never will. Bioarchaeologists studying skeletons like his found something etched directly into the bone. Faint horizontal lines, almost invisible without magnification. These are called Harris lines. They form when a growing bone stops, starves, and starts again. Reading them is like reading tree rings, except instead of recording drought years, they record the years a child nearly died. Villages of ancient children carried these lines by the dozens. Then it got worse. Scientists found tiny pinprick lesions scarring the skulls of ancient children, a condition called porotic hyperostosis. For decades, nobody agreed on the cause. Anemia, chronic infection, poor diet. Whatever the trigger, each lesion was a small body fighting something it couldn't name, and often losing quietly, in the arms of someone who couldn't do anything but hold on. Historians assumed they already knew what came next in the story. Farming, they believed, made ancient life safer. More food, more stability, fewer risks. They were wrong. Imagine a young family who has just traded the open sky of the hunt for the mud walls of a permanent village. At first, it feels like victory. Grain stored in clay jars. No more walking for days chasing herds. But the goats they now keep live close enough to touch, and the waste from 100 neighbors no longer washes away with each season's migration. When archaeologists compared the bones of hunter-gatherers to the bones of the first farmers, the farmers were shorter, sicker, and riddled with cavities that simply didn't exist before agriculture. The invention we credit with building civilization may have made the average human life measurably worse, and nobody living through it could have known why. And the twist doesn't stop there. Violence wasn't a later invention either. In 2012, at a site called Nataruk near Lake Turkana in Kenya, archaeologists uncovered at least 27 people who died together roughly 10,000 years ago. Arrow points were still lodged in some of the skeletons. A pregnant woman was found among them, her hands seemingly bound. Others showed blunt force trauma to the skull and hands, the marks of close combat, of people who raised their arms to shield themselves and were struck anyway. It's one of the oldest known examples of group violence between humans, predating farming, cities, and everything we usually blame for war. Whatever happened at Nataruk that day, it wasn't an accident. It was a massacre, and it happened long before anyone had a word for one. So if the world was this dangerous, how did anyone survive long enough to become an elder at all? That's where Shanadar's amputee comes back into the story. He couldn't hunt. He couldn't fight. He couldn't have survived alone. Someone fed him. Someone protected him, long after he stopped being useful in any practical sense. Nearby, in a different cave in France called La Chapelle aux Saints, archaeologists found another elderly Neanderthal. His spine curved with arthritis. Most of his teeth lost years before death. His jawbone reshaped around empty sockets. He'd been chewing on gums for what may have been years. Someone had been softening his food that entire time. Ancient humans weren't only killed by their world. Some of them were kept alive, patiently, deliberately, by people who had every reason to leave them behind and chose not to. Now travel 5,000 years forward and thousands of miles away, into the Alps, to a man walking alone through the high mountains with a copper axe, a bow, and a quiver of arrows. His name is unknown to us. We call him Ötzi, after the valley where hikers found his frozen body in 1991. But his final days can be read almost like a diary written in flesh and ice. His stomach still held a meal of ibex meat, eaten less than 2 hours before he died. His body was exhausted, running on fumes, likely fleeing something or someone. His joints were already arthritic. Whipworm parasites lived in his gut. His arteries were hardening decades before that was supposed to happen. 61 tattoos marked his skin, clustered almost exactly over points still used in acupuncture today. An ancient man's own desperate attempt at treating pain no one else could explain. Then an arrow struck him from behind, tore through his shoulder, and he bled out within minutes, alone on the mountain, his hand still wrapped around his own unfinished bow. The arrow didn't kill a healthy man cut down in his prime. It finished off a body that had already survived a decade of undiagnosed suffering, chased down by whoever fired that arrow, for reasons buried with him in the ice. But the deadliest cause of death in the ancient world wasn't violence, and it wasn't disease. It was giving birth. Picture a young woman, maybe 16, maybe 20, laboring for a second day inside a hut while an older woman kneels beside her, pressing herbs against her skin, murmuring words meant to comfort more than heal. There is no anesthetic. There is no way to stop the bleeding if something goes wrong, and often something does. Archaeologists have found the remains of young women with fetal bones still positioned inside the pelvis. A single, devastating moment, frozen forever, where 2 lives ended at once, discovered together in the same grave they were buried in on the same day. Some researchers believe maternal death shaped ancient societies more than almost any other force, influencing who a woman married, how early, and how desperately a village guarded the knowledge carried by its oldest, most experienced midwife, because losing her meant losing every mother who came after. Here is the fact that undoes almost everything popular culture tells us about prehistoric life. Hunter-gatherers, the group we picture as living the most precarious existence imaginable, were likely healthier and possibly longer lived on average than the farmers who came after them. More varied diets. Smaller, less crowded populations. Far less exposure to the parasites and waste that pile up wherever people stop moving. The thing we call progress came with a body count that took thousands of years to pay down. One buried child at a time. So what actually changed? Not violence. It never went away, it just changed shape. Not chronic illness. It's still here, quietly, in different forms. What changed is childhood. Vaccines, sanitation, clean water, and modern obstetric care dismantled the single deadliest phase of ancient life, the first 5 years, and the act of bringing a child into the world at all. That single shift is almost the entire gap between an ancient lifespan and a modern one, a gap paid for by generations of grieving parents whose names were never written down anywhere. Go back one last time to that skeleton in Shanidar Cave. An arm gone, an eye gone, a skull that had already survived one violent blow. Every instinct we have about prehistoric life says he should have died within days, left behind on some forgotten trail, unable to keep pace. Instead, his bones kept healing, year after year. In the flicker of a fire, someone else kept burning for him, because they decided his life was worth the weight of carrying it. What really killed ancient humans so young wasn't simply the world they lived in. It was how early death arrived. In infancy, in childbirth, in the slow accumulation of injuries no one could treat, in violence that could erupt without warning around any campfire. But buried in that same evidence, in the same bones that record every fracture and every fever, is the other half of the story. Long before medicine, before written history, before anything resembling civilization, humans were already choosing to save each other. That instinct, quiet and stubborn and entirely ordinary, may be the oldest piece of technology our species ever built.